Okay, hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of On the Wrist from Off the Cuff. Today we have a really cool, interesting, vintage-inspired diver from a really cool new brand for a channel first. The brand is actually called Nezumi Studios. They are out of Stockholm, Sweden, and they were established in 2011. They're a micro brand, creative house with an eye for vintage style. So as you can tell, the style of this watch, it definitely is very vintage inspired, and it would really be right at home with kind of right there in that kind of mid-century look where divers were still very much a new thing. So I feel like this watch in particular is definitely does homage right. It's not you know, a knockoff of any particular model or anything like that. It actually is paying homage to many different models with many little different design tweaks and design cues that make it kind of feel right at home sitting next to any one of those watches. You know, a vintage Rolex, Blancpain, or an Omega Seamaster. So it has those style cues that make it feel similar, but you sit it next to any one of those watches and it clearly doesn't look like it's a copy of any one of those watches. So kudos to Nezumi Studios for kind of creating something old and new, but still staying probably even more true to the vintage aesthetic with some of their execution choices that we'll cover in the video a little bit more in depth. So with that said, let's go ahead and zoom out. And I wanted to get the packaging in here because I thought it was actually pretty cool. The watches come in these really nice slide boxes here, and then underneath it actually, I don't know, it just has a really cool aesthetic to it. Feels, you know, right for the time, and it's not, you know, your average watch box, and it won't take up as much room as your average watch box either, which is really cool. So inside, as you can see, it actually came on this really nice vintage style black leather strap, signed buckle there, as you can see. Really nice, I'd say, really nicely done. Of course, this actually is a loaner model, so I didn't want to wear out the strap too much there, but I definitely wanted to show you guys because I thought that this was a very cool piece and definitely worth a look. So let's go ahead and just have that here in the background and take a closer look at this particular model here. So this is the Baleine Diver. Now a little bit about a dive watch, some key common characteristics and design languages. You know, you're going to be looking for something with water resistance or some type of screw down crown, something that's tough, legible, dive time bezel, and having a diver's extension, if possible, is always nice. This particular model is considered the Baleine Brushed. Now, depending on what finish choice you choose is going to depend on kind of the color combination as far as the dial, the lume, and the handset color. So the brushed model is going to have this particular color combination, and then if you get brushed and polished, it's actually going to have another color combination, which we'll cover later on in the episode. So these actually go for roughly, the price is about $485 US without VAT. Their actual list price is 415 euro. So, you know, I think that's actually a pretty good deal considering what you get, the specs, the execution. I think it's definitely for a particular buyer that's looking for something, and I think this could be exactly what a lot of buyers are looking for, which definitely holds value in itself. So as far as the specs go, this is 40 millimeters wide. It has a 47 millimeter lug to lug width, and then it has a 14 millimeter height, which it actually handles very well because it has this nice tight mid case. And then you can see there's actually, you know, of course, this case back adds a little bit of thickness, and then the way the bezel is lifted up, and that is very much a, you know, point of design and functionality, how there is that space there, and definitely very easily grippable. And then of course that nice dome sapphire also does add a little bit of height, but because of the way they designed it and how everything's kind of broken up, I think it really makes the height, you know, not as much of an issue as if they just made this one big slab case where everything was kind of sunk in and solid, because you do have a little bit more visual interest there and some extra lines to kind of break everything up. It doesn't feel like it's, you know, that thick, and even with the domed sapphire, you know, which does make it a little bit taller, I think it doesn't make the watch wear tall at all, just because of the way that everything has been crafted. Now, the crystal is a sapphire crystal. It's double domed, which means it's domed on the outside and domed on the inside, so there's not going to be a bunch of distortion when you look at it at an angle, which helps it stay more legible, which is definitely a big part of getting a diver, so that is good news for you. And then, as you can see, we have an aluminum insert. It's fully indexed, kind of in that very kind of mill sub style, but definitely a new twist the way they did the numerals there. And then you have the loom pip. The bezel is 60 clicks, unidirectional, so it's only going to go one way. You know, of course it is 60 clicks. It's not the most advanced thing. So it actually turns really, really smoothly, and it's purposeful. It doesn't just like, you can't just accidentally make a turn or anything. But when you want it to turn, it's going to be easy to turn, even with these gloves on. I don't want you guys to get a sound bite there. So, a little lower. Okay, so nice bezel action. Kind of reminds me of the Seiko SKX. You know, it's a little bit smoother. It's not the super tightest, notchiest feeling. But, I mean, super notchy isn't necessarily better. You know, this is definitely going to be very functional still. And then, you know, it feels really good in the hand. I've had some bezels that were just so tight and so notchy that I didn't even want to turn them. So, it's one of those things where I think there's a sweet spot to be found. This is definitely more on the looser side, but I wouldn't call it, you know, a loose in any type of negative term or any negative connotation attached to that. So I'd say it's more on the smooth side, I guess, is the way I would describe it. Now, the movement inside here is actually the Seiko NH35 movement, which is similar to the, well, it basically is the Seiko movement, the 4R35 movement, if you're familiar with it, which is basically 35 designated versus 36, which would be a day date. This is just the date, as you can see there, at the 4.5, in between the 4 and the 5, and then it does have this really nice stamped case back, which I think the way that they cut it is actually quite comfortable and lays flat on your wrist, but also nice to look at, and does add some dimension and a little bit of visual interest when you pick the watch up. So I think that was actually pretty well executed as well. The crown is a screw down crown, and it is signed very nicely there, as you can see. It's not some huge crown, it's not some tiny crown. I think it's just kind of well proportioned for this particular model. The lug width is 20 millimeters, so you'll be able to fit this on a lot of great NATO straps, leather straps, and this color palette I think is really what's going to play well with any of those, you know, a vintage leather, or, you know, a Marine National strap, or, you know, certain types of NATOs. Of course, this faded gray dial definitely is going to tie in really, really well with that Admiralty gray NATO that I just, you know, I'm a huge fan of. Anytime a brand makes something in that tone of gray, I pick it up. So I think that's really great, and I actually probably would have had it reviewed on a NATO, but I know that this is an option here, and people are probably interested to see how this bad boy looks on this really cool Jubilee. So I wanted to make sure that we were able to get that on video and kind of give you guys a look at it. So as far as the dial goes, just to talk a little bit more about it, it is that vintage black / gray dial, and it's faded in a way that really makes it seem more patinaed. It doesn't just seem like a gray dial that they chose. It actually looks like it's been faded. It has a little bit of a tint and a tinge to it. I think that one, warm the dial up, and two, it just makes it more of a versatile wear as far as the color palette goes, and depending on what you're going to wear with it, what type of strap, I think it actually is probably the better choice for versatility wise versus some of the other color combinations. So I really do like that a lot. Now this is of course 20 atmospheres, water resistant, or 200 meters. As I covered before, 20 millimeter lugs. It has 20 millimeters down to an 18 taper, and that would be on the strap. And then I believe it also is true for this nice solid Jubilee. So as you can see, the center links there are solid, but everything is nice and brushed. And it's not some super thick overbuilt Jubilee. It really feels like a classic vintage Jubilee. And then the clasp, I think, is the same case. Yeah, it's a stamped clasp, but it really suits the watch style for this era. I think it just makes sense and feels really comfortable on the wrist, and cuts down on any heft by having it like that. So let's go ahead and get it on the wrist really quickly here so you guys can get an idea of what this looks like on my 7 1/4 inch wrist. So as you can see, wears really, really nicely. That Jubilee is very comfortable. I can get tons of range of motion there. Put this down. I think, as you can see, really, really nice. Great proportions. Doesn't feel too tall. I mean, I think, of course, if I pump it out at the camera, it's gonna look big, but in all actuality, it wears actually really, really nicely, and it's not something I feel like is some big top-heavy watch. I think it actually wears super nice for what it is. And it definitely kind of adds to the wrist presence, of course. And then down on, as you can see with my arm pushed down a little bit, you get a little bit of a better idea as far as scale goes. This, of course, is a very classic 40 millimeters, and it doesn't have super long or wide lugs, so it wears like a 40 millimeter should. Although the dial is probably a little bit bigger than a vintage model would be, the proportions I think still hold pretty well. Now on the wrist, really great proportions. I mean, really any wrist I think could wear this very, very comfortably. It's really just a great kind of vintage remix, and it has really value added in the style and the design, because it's not paying homage to one watch. It's paying homage to a whole series and a whole time, and it does that in, I think, a really smart way. It really keys into that timeline without actually looking like any of those watches. In particular, it has certain aspects of a lot of those original divers, but it does it in a way that I think would help it blend in if it was released, back in the 50s and 60s. So I think that's one of the main things, is to have something that still meets that aesthetic, still has those proportions, but it's not, a rip off of another watch. So I think that's just really cool. And kudos to Nezumi for designing a watch. I think that is so aesthetically pleasing. Now, as far as model variants go, there is also a brushed and polished case, which is going to have a gilt dial, and then there's also a black DLC case that is going to have the vintage dial and vintage lume, as you see here. Now, as far as comparable models go, there's a ton of other vintage inspired divers, but many of them are more derivative, if not all of them. And well, I shouldn't say that. There are actually a lot of vintage style designs that are out there that also tie back without muddying up everything, with kind of trying to look like a sub or a Seamaster. There are some good options out there, but I think for the price, this one definitely does a lot. So that's really impressive. And then, of course, the ones that are more derivative, your Steinhardts and whatnot, are going to cost more. So those watches are going to cost more, and they're going to look like something else. This is going to look like itself, and it's going to cost less. So I think that's definitely a value proposition right there. Really, the bottom line is this watch pulls off the vintage vibe very nicely. So really liking it. Let's go ahead and get a lume shot here. Push this off. We'll zoom in. Without getting too close. I don't want it to get out of focus there. All right. So here we go. Let's go ahead and hit it with some black light. Get it nice and charged up here. Okay. So as you can see, the lume is quite nice, nothing crazy. I don't think we were expecting it to be though, just considering the style of the lume. You know, it's not a big applied deep indices. These are printed on there, and then it's also vintage, so it's gonna be a little bit more dim than, let's say, something that's in BGW9 there. So let's go ahead and get some low light transitions. So as you can see there, really beautiful. I think as when you take a look at it, it really does shine. And that brushed finish, just the way the light plays off of it, the way the light plays off of the dial. I think that looks really good. So if you haven't seen my reviews before, this is something that I kind of started doing because my studio lights are quite bright and not necessarily truly depictive of the lighting experiences you're gonna have if you pick up one of these watches. So I wanted to actually get some low light shots there, some transitions, so you can kind of get a look at what it would look like. Really, my lights are more gonna imitate direct sunlight, and you know, chances are you're not going to be in direct sunlight all the time. Maybe if you're a lifeguard, you'll be sitting out in the sun all day and the watch is going to look a lot like this. But for most of you, you're going to be wearing this indoors. You know, you'll be in the shade, so you know, the watch isn't always going to appear that way. And you know, but when it's well lit like this, I think you get a really nice idea as far as details go and whatnot. So I definitely do like to have these nice bright lights on it, so you guys can get a very nice detailed look. So, I mean, as far as the bottom line goes on this, again, it really just pulls off the vintage vibe. The choices they made, I think, were spot on. I think they really put together a cool vintage style watch that isn't copying anything. You know, maybe it's copying 10 things. You know, share your opinion below if you think that's the case. To me, I don't think so. I think that it, you know, it did what, let's say, Christopher Ward did, kind of, you know, in its infancy. It created the C60, which definitely paid homage to definitely a lot of different brands and models. But it did it in a way that was something new and different and had a little twist to it, until that kind of became its own design language. I think what Nezumi Studios has done here is something very similar. They took a lot of different design cues and they put them together, but they didn't blatantly copy anything. You know, they're not saying, hey, this is an homage watch to a mill sub. They're not saying this is an homage watch to a Seamaster or a GMT2 or a you know, a Blancpain 50 Fathoms. It's not. It's not an homage to a vintage Tudor. It's kind of a reimagining, I guess you could say, of a watch from that era. And I think what they did is they imagined something that I could really see. It's a realistic, I think, depiction of a watch that we could have seen in that era. And this would, you know, be right at home sitting next to a Seamaster 300. And I think, honestly, back then, if you would have had this sitting next to a Seamaster 300, you would have been pretty impressed with it. So with that said, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. If you liked the video, please do hit like. If you haven't already, please do subscribe for more content just like this. Thanks, guys. Bye.